Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday to you. It's a beautiful morning, and it's 10 o'clock. It's time for 10 with Tim. We did 2 chapters for today, going verse by verse through the book of Ezekiel, chapters 15 and 16. What'd y'all think about chapter 16? Don't tell me. I have a feeling I know what you were thinking. Let's talk about chapter 15 first. It's short. I know it's a lot of reading for today, but getting through the book of Ezekiel, we're going to take some days where we're going to do some big chunks. Some of that is to hold certain sections together. Chapter 16, there's no place to divide that. And so we just have to sort of plunge through it. And chapter 15 itself is kind of, I think, too short to stand on its own. Chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. This section we're coming into now is a section of Ezekiel's preaching. It's a little bit different. Remember, up to this point, we've had primarily these enacted prophecies. He acts out the message in such a way as to cause his hard-hearted, hard-headed, never listening audience to pay attention. But in 15 to 19, these chapters, there are these extended metaphors. Remember in grammar class studying what a metaphor is? A simile is when you say something is like something. A metaphor is when you say it is something. And so in chapter 15, it said that Jerusalem is like a useless vine. And we'll talk about that for just a second. And then chapter 16, Jerusalem is like a cheap prostitute. And we'll come to that in a second too. Chapter 15, the useless vine. Again, it's a really basic kind of metaphor that just describes the way that Jerusalem itself has become in God's eyes useless. A vine, as you know, if it were a piece of wood, you could use it for something, a walking stick or a peg, to hang your tools on the wall. That's what Ezekiel says. But as it is, just, these vine trimmings, these vine clippings, like what you prune and pitch into the fire, that they're not good for anything. So they're useless and thrown into the fire. In Scripture, fire has sort of 2 purposes, refining and destruction. Sometimes fire is seen as that which burns away impurities and then leaves that which is useful, that which is valuable. But in chapter 15, we're not talking about refining fire. We're talking about total destruction. That's the point. Let me go so far as to say, if it manages to survive the first fire, it's just going to fall into another one, which is probably a reference to the fact that there was this first wave of defeat and exile, and there's going to be a coming second wave. And that's what he's saying, man. It's not just one fire. It's going to be 2 fires. Nobody escapes. And that's sort of the point of chapter 15. Can we talk about chapter 16? Probably not. This is like one of the single chapters in all the Bible that Charles Spurgeon refused to preach, because he said you can't even read this out loud in public. You can't read this chapter in public. It really is pretty raunchy. Now we're talking about Jerusalem here, not just Israel in general, but Jerusalem. And so let that sink in for just a moment. Not just Israel, but Jerusalem. And in some ways, it's sort of an appropriate, in some ways, a very literal kind of metaphor. For example, it says that you're nothing but a Canaanite, your father was an Amorite, your mother was a Hittite. Well, see, if you talk about the people of Israel, they came from Egypt, they wandered in, right? Led by, Joshua, but the city of Jerusalem is different. It was already there. In the book of Joshua, it explains that it was an Amorite town. It has these pagan roots. The Israelites didn't build Jerusalem. It was there. So it has these Amorite and Canaanite roots, right? So it's like you got an Amorite father and a Hittite, a Canaanite mother that come together, but they don't love you, and so they abandon you, and that's how the metaphor begins. It extends rather graphically and violently. There are several reasons why you and I are probably going to have trouble even interpreting this chapter, primarily because of our own cultural expectations and assumptions. I mean, for example, when we read this part where the Lord comes by and finds this baby Jerusalem abandoned on the street, no one is. It's like a newborn that's just thrown out, not even cleaned. And so God finds the baby there in its own blood, in its own afterbirth, and he cleans the baby, rescues the baby. And you not think, oh, sweet, well, of course he would. That wouldn't anybody, but no. In the ancient world, you wouldn't do that. For this simple reason, if you did that, you'd have a house full. I mean, people abandon babies all the time, and especially baby girls. It was not uncommon, and it wasn't considered something you had to do to rescue one. Babies simply died by exposure all the time. And so that's the first thing. It's shocking that the Lord would rescue a baby girl like that. Now, again, if you did rescue one of those babies being left out to die, it would be suspicious. Like what are you going to do with that baby? And if you did rescue a girl like that, typically they were rescued for reasons of prostitution, just taken into human trafficking, into sex work. And so that in itself, it turns our expectations upside down. It's shocking that God would rescue a baby girl out of love. So that first part in itself is shocking. And then the marriage, and the scripture goes on to say that she grew like a weed, and she grew up beautifully. And then the Lord comes back and lays his cloak. He covers her nakedness. It's like Ruth and Boaz, right? It's that a quasi-legal sign of having chosen a bride, and then he takes her as his wife, just out of love. Now, what follows is this description of their marriage. And again, because our expectations and sensitivities for marriage are so radically different, it's hard for us to really see what this passage is about. For example, in our day, we inevitably see marriage as some sort of equal union. We're somehow co-equal partners. I know some of you are complementarian and all of this, and I know what you're saying, but I'm telling you, you still don't have the kind of expectations that Ezekiel and his audience would have had. This wife, for example, when the Lord lavishes all of these riches and wealth upon her, the amazing food and lotions and perfumes and clothes, and then she takes it out and wastes all her finery in riotous living. That would be shocking in the ancient world, because understand, she's the wife. That stuff isn't hers. It belongs to her husband. It's unthinkable that a wife would somehow think that any of that belongs to her. Now you and I, part of us is thinking, good for her. She went out, she got a job outside the home. We're so used to that sort of cultural, advancement for women, but it's shocking in this passage that the woman would in any way go against her husband, or in any way use what he's given her as if it were her own. Did you see that? And so for reasons like that, you and I have a really hard time with this passage at all. And then not to mention the fact that we are sort of trained to sanitize this language, to sanitize. For example, you would not allow me to say that Jerusalem is a cheap whore that spreads her legs for everybody who walks by, but that's what Ezekiel says. Forgive me, that's what Ezekiel says. And he says worse. He says much worse. And so this is why Spurgeon and others have said, well, you can't preach this. Because the only way that you would allow me to preach this passage would be if I somehow made it, I'm going to have to, Disneyfy it. I'm going to have to make it suitable for everybody's sensitivities. And if you do that, you lose the graphic and intentionally ugly portrayal of Jerusalem's sin. Do you see that? If I call her anything other than what Ezekiel calls her, I'm making her sound better. And Ezekiel has no intentions of making her sound better. He's trying to talk about the sins of the people. And he's talking to the sins of the people with people who don't think they sin. You understand? And so he's intentionally shocking them so that they will understand this is how sinful you are. This is how wicked you are. Do you know? And so when you're speaking to people who are half deaf, you have to shout. And so chapter 16 shouts in its graphic language. It is not PG. You understand? And it's not sanitized, for a nice church audience. Because honestly, this ain't a nice church audience. He's talking to God's people who no longer remember that they're God's people. And that's part of the beauty of this chapter, because he wants them to remember where they were when God found them. Remember where you were. Remember how you were, how helpless you were. You understand how desperate and destitute you were. And that's a good lesson for all of us. You and I tend to wander away from the Lord when we forget where we were when he found us. On the side of the road, kicking and mewing, in our own blood, abandoned and unloved. God says, remember where you were when I found you. And so that's chapter 16. Shockingly for us, and if you're reading through the book of Ezekiel, it ends on a note of real hope. The idea is, I am going to remember the covenant I made with you. I'm going to reaffirm the covenant. You're going to know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel, even though, it starts out, the scroll on two sides, that's full of funeral songs and bad news, there is frequently in the preaching of Ezekiel these notes of good news. And on the really tail end of this really graphic, raunchy passage of preaching, there is in verses, 53 to 63, a real message of hope. I took a minute over, you guys, for a passage that Spurgeon says I shouldn't have been talking about at all. So there you go. Again, part of me wants to, apologize, for saying some of the things I said in this passage, but you've read it, right? So if you read it, I didn't say anything as bad as what Ezekiel said. So again, I don't mean to shock or offend you, but Ezekiel does mean to shock and offend you if it makes you see your sin. You understand what I'm saying? So tomorrow, pick up on chapter 17, chapter 17, verses 1 to 24. We'll do that whole chapter, and then we'll pick up from there. So tomorrow, chapter 17. Listen, have a good Wednesday. Enjoy the sunshine. I will see you in the morning, Lord willing, 10 o'clock for Tim with Tim. Did I say I love you guys? I love you guys.